Thank you for your time, but I wanted to talk to you first, not about the Liberal Party, because you've written with great clarity about that, but about China. You've recently said of China, because everyone's worried about China and talking about China, you said the tailwind for China is now over. Its power on the global stage may have already peaked. But then you added, in many instances, this marks one of the more dangerous periods in global affairs, which tend to be disrupted more often by declining rather than rising powers. Dave, thank you for your time, but can you amplify that point?
Good evening, Alan. It's a great pleasure to join you. Look, China's growth in economic power, but also military power, has very much been driven by favourable demography over the past several decades, really. But we see China's demography is now going into reverse. Their overall population is shrinking, their working age population is shrinking, and they have a birth rate which puts them on a par with countries like Italy and Spain in southern Europe, far less than the replacement rate. Now, I don't know of any country in history that has a shrinking population and a shrinking working age population that still is growing in the metric of power. It's very difficult to grow your economy. It's very difficult to grow your military if you've got a shrinking workforce and a shrinking tax base. But in many respects, and this is the point I noted, a declining power, or a power that thinks its best days might be behind it rather than ahead of us, often is tempted to try and lock in the gains, if you like, at its peak of the international system. And I worry a little that China under Xi Jinping sees these next few years as an opportunity to remake the world as much as it can in its own image before it goes into that demographic decline.
Just to go back a bit here, you have written very interestingly that the population has fallen for the first time since 1961. You mentioned a figure dropping by 850,000. Is this a consequence, well, not just a consequence of the one-child policy introduced in 1980, but has the rising middle class in China embraced the Western commitment towards smaller families and having children later?
Look, absolutely. It's a product of both. The one-child policy was obviously has accelerated this, but even now that one-child policy has been lifted, and in fact the People's Republic of China now provides encouragement for families to have 2 or 3 children. But that's not happening. The birth rate isn't shifting, and it's because, like we see in other middle-class countries and developing countries around the world, as countries get richer, women wish to have careers, they tend to marry later, they tend to have children later, and they tend to have smaller families as well. So even though the one-child policy is no longer in existence really in China and no longer on the statute book, so to speak, their birth rate is still very low, and that's quite a hard thing to reverse. You can mandate the number of people beyond which people can no longer have children, but to encourage them to have more is pretty difficult, as we've all found.
All right, now people listening to you are saying what they say every day. What's that mean for China's place as a global power?
Well, I think it means that China's rise up the ranks of the global powers, and that's been the big feature, the big story in the international system over the last 3 decades. China's entry into the world economy, its growth as a share of the world economy, now the second largest economy by some measure, and its growth in military power as well. That is going to be harder to sustain. I mean, we already see that in China's growth figures. China, which used to quite readily crack 2 digits and see growth of 10 or 11%, is now back to 5% forecast for this year. Their population's getting older. All the gains they had from moving a rural population to urban and city centres, that's already been harvested. They've moved up the value chain because labour now costs more there. It's going to be much harder for them to grow at the same rate they have.